Welcome back to the deep dive. We received a document, actually a newsletter titled Text Collé from MY.PATRIOTS.EUS.
Right, newsletter EUS-005 specifically.
Exactly. And our mission today is to really get into the main ideas presented here.
It certainly jumps into some complex territory geopolitically speaking.
It does, and uses some terms, some phrasing that might be new for some listeners. So let's just dive right in.
Absolutely. It's a very particular perspective on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and, the role of international bodies. Raises some tough questions.
It really does, which makes it worth unpacking, I think.
For sure.
Okay, so the first thing, and it really jumps out, is this word they use, palesticide.
Palesticide. It's striking, isn't it?
Very. How do they define it exactly?
Well, the newsletter spells it out.
Yeah.
A combination of Palestine and genocide.
Okay.
They credit it initially to a Khalid Omana,
Right.
and say it was spread more widely by a group called Intifadata.icu, particularly during the conflict in Gaza.
And the purpose of the term.
Yeah.
It's obviously meant to be provocative.
Highly. I mean, the stated intention is to condemn what they describe as a systematic occupation, an erasure of historic Palestine.
So it's not just physical conflict.
No, not at all. It includes cultural annihilation, territorial erasure, the whole identity,
It reframes the whole situation, really. Portrays it as existential.
Precisely. It's a very strong term meant to signal, from their viewpoint, a deliberate effort to eliminate Palestinian presence and history. It's quite an indictment.
Okay. Then, moving on from that term, they tackle the two-state solution.
Ah, yes, the perennial topic.
And they don't seem to view it very favorably.
Not in the slightest. They actually call it a deliberately created political utopia.
A political utopia. That's interesting phrasing. Why utopia?
Well, their argument, and it's quite pointed, is that it's not a genuine solution,
Okay.
but rather a tool designed, in their view, to obliterate historical Palestine.
Oh, who's been?
They mention neo-colonial interests, suggesting powerful entities gain from this specific setup.
And they connect this to the UN.
Directly. They argue that votes within the UN, especially permanent Security Council members and some newer Gulf states,
Yes.
they claim these votes are simulated.
Simulated. What do they mean by that? Like, not real?
Sort of. The implication is that the votes aren't genuine expressions of finding a solution, but are more about maintaining a status quo.
A status quo that benefits those powerful interests they mentioned.
That seems to be the core of their critique. It challenges the whole legitimacy of that diplomatic process, doesn't it?
It really does. So if they reject the two-state solution so strongly, what's their alternative?
They propose something called self-recognition of Palestine.
Self-recognition. Okay, what does that entail?
Well, this is where it gets perhaps quite unexpected for many.
How so?
Part of the self-recognition involves calling for a Jewish oblast in Tel Aviv.
A Jewish oblast in Tel Aviv as part of a Palestinian self-recognition.
Yes. They frame it as a transitional solution.
A transitional solution. How does that connect back to their idea of palesticide?
They seem to present it as a way to define what they call palesticide through erasure, almost like reversing the dynamic, perhaps.
By defining a specific Jewish space within their proposed future Palestine.
It appears so. It's definitely a concept that makes you stop and think way outside the usual boxes.
No kidding. Very unconventional.
Okay.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. The newsletter also talks about the definition of war.
Right. They have a specific take on that, too, in the Palestinian context.
How do they define war, then?
Pretty traditionally, actually. A conflict between two opposing distinct armed forces, organized armies.
Go ahead, standard definition.
But then they argue that in Palestine, there isn't really a constituted Palestinian army in that sense.
So if it's not a war, by their definition, what is it?
They frame it more as a struggle for self-determination.
Makes sense from their perspective.
But then here's where it seems a bit paradoxical, or at least they point out a tension.
What's the tension?
They describe it as a lawless and faithless struggle. Those are their words.
Yeah.
Yet they note it's being kind of reorganized or dealt with by states who are party to the Rome Statute.
The International Criminal Court.
Exactly, the ICC.
So what's their point about the ICC's involvement?
Their contention is that this judicial body, the ICC, is actually used quite often to justify and legitimize the existing order.
The order maintained by the UN.
That's the connection they make. They see the ICC not as this impartial dispenser of justice.
But as another tool.
Precisely. A tool that ultimately props up the very system they're criticizing.
That's a really critical perspective on international law itself.
It is, suggesting these institutions, maybe set up with good intentions, end up reinforcing a power structure.
Okay, so we've got palesticide, the critique of the two-state solution, and the UN, their view on war, and the ICC. Now, what about the group itself, patriots.EUS?
Right, the source of the newsletter, they position themselves clearly.
How's
As challengers, they explicitly state they challenge the dominance of the United Nations.
So it's bigger than just the Palestine issue for them.
Much bigger. They have a vision for a different kind of global structure entirely.
Okay, tell us about that. What's their alternative vision?
They talk about creating a global zone.
Global zone.
Yeah, founded on common values and, importantly, a free trade area without fiscal or commercial taxes.
Wow, okay. No taxes.
That's
That's ambitious.
It's certainly a radical economic idea, a major departure from, well, pretty much any existing international system.
What's the driving principle behind that?
Competition. They emphasize leveraging competition to spur innovation. That's the core of their innovative paradigm, as they call it.
So competition, innovation, free trade, no taxes, leading to what?
Ultimately, they aim to form new collective arrangements.
Breaking away from the current UN-centric model.
Exactly, breaking away from the old order. They even float the idea of potentially leading towards a more agile and resilient Euro-Atlantic Confederation.
A confederation. So a fundamental reshaping of international relations.
That seems to be the long-term goal they're putting forward, a really significant shift.
And they want people to discuss these ideas.
Oh, definitely. The newsletter finishes with an explicit invitation.
To debate.
Yes, to debate and share thoughts on this sensitive topic, directing people to their Facebook page, facebook.com/patriots.EUS.
And they encourage sharing it too, right?
Right. View other resources, share on social media. They clearly want these ideas out there, generating discussion.
Okay, so let's try to quickly recap the core points from this Text Calais newsletter.
Good idea.
First, the term palesticide, reframing the conflict as systematic erasure.
Then, the critique of the two-state solution as a political utopia serving neo-colonial interests, with UN votes possibly being simulated.
Right. And their alternative, self-recognition, which includes that surprising proposal for a Jewish oblast in Tel Aviv as a transitional step.
Yep. Then there's their specific definition of war versus self-determination and the critique of the ICC as legitimizing the current UN order.
And finally, the patriots.eus movement itself, challenging the UN, proposing this global tax-free, competition-driven zone.
Potentially leading to new structures, like a Euro-Atlantic Confederation.
It's definitely a dense set of arguments, and as you said, very challenging to mainstream views.
Absolutely. The language, the proposed solutions, they operate outside the usual discourse on these matters.
So thinking about all this quite different analysis, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it, about the power dynamics maybe hidden within organizations like the UN.
It does raise that question.
And, what does the rise of movements like patriots.eus, putting forward such alternative visions, actually signify for where global governance might be heading in the future?
That's the big question, isn't it? It forces us to consider the sheer diversity of perspectives out there, the different futures people are imagining and pushing for. Definitely food for thought.
Indeed. Something to reflect on long after this deep dive.